I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the context that informs Timbuktu, which we'll be watching tonight. So, in 2011, NATO, led by the United States and France, began what would be a short, violent air invasion of Libya, ostensibly to oust its dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, and his corrupt regime. The images from this period, the denouement to the Arab Spring, have become familiar to all of us. The crowds of protesters bravely resisting the increasing regime of terror unleashed upon them by a government faced with its inevitable end. Benghazi and its bombing, the heartbreaking sight of African immigrants thrown by the boatload into the sea, the fall of Tripoli in August of that year, and of course, Gaddafi's own death, televised across the world. The invasion of Libya was a moment of hope. Through international cooperation, aid, and effort, disaster was averted, and a humanitarian crisis stopped, as one of the world's most corrupt dictators was overthrown in favor of the possibility of democracy. Yet the resonances of that invasion and of that time were not so simple. Ousted from power, but refusing to accept defeat, Gaddafi's former soldiers fled, uniting with unlikely allies in al-Qaeda, ACME, the international drug trade, and more, to bring their particular brand of localized terror to the rest of North Africa. Mali, or French Sudan as it was once known, was hit particularly hard, made vulnerable both by its artificial boundaries, a hangover from colonialism, and a weak regime in Bamako. By early 2012, northern Mali, an area known as Azawad, was overrun by a group of rebels known as the Azawad National Liberation Movement, or Mouvement National de la Libération de Azawad, comprised primarily of Malian soldiers who had fought for Gaddafi and vanquished, returned home in anger, buttressed by the sophisticated weaponry and support of their former patron's army. The rebel movement advanced through the north, taking one town after another and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. On April 1st of that year, Timbuktu fell. Allegedly a fight for the rights and autonomy of the Tuareg people of the north of Mali, the fall of Timbuktu would trigger a coup d'etat and lead to months of violent conflict, with surprisingly little attention paid by the international community once so intent on intervention elsewhere. Sissako's Timbuktu examines the early days of this period, developing a visual record of the encroaching occupation. All too often, we in the West are invited, or in fact encouraged, to view Africa as a homogeneous space. We see it as a single unit, a country, rather than a continent of diverse nations, communities, and people. Here, Sissako shows us how very wrong we are. Opening with scenes of destruction as gun-wielding rebel soldiers indiscriminately hunt wildlife and ancient art alike, out of pleasure or boredom, the film produces a stunning portrait of the toll of international politics on the lives of ordinary people. Centering on Herder Kidane and his family, whose personal conflicts intertwine with the devastation of the city to tragic results, Timbuktu explores the multiple levels at which occupation, violence, and control overtake an entire community. The history of Mali is a complicated one, dating from the founding of the empire in the 13th century, a period in which the great cultural, artistic, and trading center of Timbuktu flourished. Works from the time, including the Epic of Sundiata, remain touchstone texts in African literary writing and film to the present day. From its occupation by French colonial forces as part of French West Africa in the 19th century, to its independence in 1960 through to the events of 2012, Mali remained a beacon of culture and hope, not just in West Africa, but across the continent more widely. Sissako does not explicitly call upon the nation's complicated past. This is not a didactic film. But Timbuktu, throughout its course, shows the many afterlives which resonate with a subtlety and nuance rare in depictions of contemporary African conflict. The film explores the extent to which the legacies of the past continue to wreak their effects in the present. In many ways, this is a film about what happens when a zealous quest for purity, in whatever form, fossilizes, and what happens when we try to erase the past. It's a film about a cow called GPS, and a film about a family and a community, but at the same time, it's so much more than that. Throughout the film, Sissako weaves together a series of interrelated characters whose literal lack of a common language. The film contains dialogue in Tuareg, Bambara, Arabic, and French, speaks sometimes with comedic effect to the larger failures in communication and connection. While urgent as a film both timeless and very much of its time, Timbuktu further stands within a tradition of African filmmaking, using a visual language with significant intertextual resonances. And here I'm thinking, for instance, of an image early in the film of heaps of masks in the sands of the Sahel, and which engages as much as it frustrates wider idioms. Timbuktu is not simply a film of occupation, but a film which explores what happens when devotion becomes fanaticism and the myriad ways in which the specular conflicts which we see played out on an international stage insert themselves into the daily lives of individuals. It is a film about the complexity of morality, resistance, and refusal in the face of extremist violence. Women in particular take a central role in the film, with the literal administration of their bodies and lives foregrounding the arbitrary nature of power, both in its banality and its urgency. I was particularly struck on watching this film in November at Africa Eye by the way in which the seemingly opposed spaces of tradition and modernity are woven together, not as diametric opposites through Sissako's visual language. I was struck as well by the care and sensitivity with which the subject matter is handled. Timbuktu is an important film, an urgent film, a vital film, but it is also a beautiful film, and I hope very much that you enjoy watching it tonight. I guess that I would wonder what your impressions were of the film. To start out with, was there any scene in particular which resonated with members of the audience, or anything in particular in the visual imagery that you felt?
Or indeed if anybody
or if there are any questions or comments more broadly.
So if you just wait for the microphone, thanks.
The jihadists, we should refer to them, they were curiously confused and powerless in lots of the situations that were depicted, and wonder why he chose to do that, and whether you feel that was realistic. It's not the kind of mega brutalized kind of imagery that we get on the news every night.
I mean, I think that I'm not the director, so obviously I can't speak for why he did it, but I would imagine that it's part of the complexity of the film. I mean, I don't think we could suggest that the jihadists come off per se as sympathetic or as heroic, but they come off as complex. I particularly was touched by the moment when Abdul Karim, the jihadist we spend the most time with, is trying to hide that he's smoking, and that kind of human moment when Omar says, "It's okay, you can smoke around me." And it's not redemptive to show them in that way in the least, but I think that it goes beyond the kind of caricatures that we often get in the media. And as far as their own powerlessness, well, many of them are powerless people. I mean, many of these are uneducated young men from deprived conditions. Many of them would be people who would have gone to fight in other conflicts in other places as paid mercenaries. Many of them would not have access to very much or actually have that much power. And so I do think that it's accurate to be showing it in that sense, but at the same time, they hold a tremendous amount of power, as we see in all of the scenes of violence. They hold a tremendous amount of power in the community, but I suppose it's just not as simple as kind of black and white, good and evil. Although I also think that Sissako does a good job of not blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator too much. I mean, there's complexity without there being kind of an alibi or a justification, which I think is important. Yes. Are there any, would you like to follow up or any other questions?
Hi, this isn't a long question or anything. I just think it's thoroughly ironic that the certificate at the beginning described the film as containing moderate violence.
How would you describe it?
I don't want to put a label on, to be honest. I don't think that's particularly helpful.
I mean, I think if anything, it's epistemic violence, or like a violence that isn't really quantifiable in that sense. It's the kind of violence of an entire civilization being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. It's the idea of moderation that just sort of appalls me.
Yeah. That is a good point.
Yeah, that's
One for the licensing
well,
people.
that's the British Board of Film Classification. And anybody else? I mean, otherwise, what I'd suggest, I mean, if people, do want to discuss a bit more informally, then we can move out into the cafe bar and.
Yeah, and I think that
discuss it there.
some of the things you can think about is, well, the ending and the kind of ambiguity of the ending of what happens. Who is the bike rider? Who is that? What happens to the children? And I think also what I find really important about this film is how women are central characters. They may not have a tremendous amount of dialogue, but it is through their experiences that we see exactly what is going on in this place. The scene when the woman gets 80 lashes for singing and being in the room, and the men sit by untouched. Or when we watch, the fishmonger being told she has to wear gloves, but just all the myriad ways that women's bodies and their kind of lives, the violence against them, it's almost like an index of the violence against the community as a whole. And I think it also highlights the kind of absurdity, but also the strength, the resistance, the woman singing when she's getting whipped, the woman speaking about Haiti, walking through the streets with her head uncovered, refusing to take any of this seriously. And I think that that's a really important thing as well for this particular film.
Oh, there's a question there, Ingrid. Comment.
It's just a response to your question about the certification and violence. I think that the incredible skill of this film is that it's shockingly violent without seeing very much violent on screen.
Yeah, it's true.
And the same is true for quite some of the other themes in the film, that we understand from the acting and from the script and from the way it's filmed a huge amount that isn't actually said or isn't even stated directly. And I think that's an incredible skill. I think this filmmaker is really very special, and this film is too.
I think there's a question.
There's somebody.
In the back.
Yeah.
You mentioned the woman from Haiti who seemed to be like a sort of prophetess.
Mm-hmm.
And the big surprise for me in viewing the film was she was the character that I really thought was going to come up into trouble against the Islamic forces. And yet somehow she seemed to override them, and she didn't seem to be, controlled or punished in any way by them. And I wonder what you thought the director was getting at with giving her this sort of position above the conflicts or whatever.
I mean, I don't know that I'd say she was above the conflict. It was almost like she was like in some parallel world, right? I mean, I think she's figured as a kind of mad woman, priestess figure. We see it in her clothes and the costuming and the way that she's walking around and her rooster, all of which has kind of ceremonial overtones. But I suppose that for me, the character was really important to the film, both in showing the different ways in which people resist to these sorts of regimes. And it might be a person that we look at and say, well, she's a mad woman, but in fact, she's surviving and she's actually carrying on with the sort of life that she lives. And I also think that particular character is highlighting the absurdity of the whole situation, the absurdity of these laws, the absurdity of this rule. I mean, she literally laughs in their faces, walks up to them, calls them assholes, and walks away. And I think that really highlights, without really saying anything or being didactic, the fundamental absurdity of the entire situation.
Oh, question, just here. Oh, and then, sorry, take the question at the back first, and then down. Give you time to come down with the mic.
Again, not so much a question as what the scene that stuck with me was the football sequence, which I thought was incredible. To go back to what the lady was saying earlier, that summed up the theme of the film to me, that sense of defiance and humanity. I thought that was incredible.
Yeah, and I think it's like simultaneously hilarious and inspiring, but also heartbreaking to see these kids running around so invested in a football game when they're not allowed to have a football.
Could you remind us of the context of this film? It was made a couple of years ago.
It came out last year.
Came out last year, and the situation in Timbuktu is what now?
As far it's ameliorated somewhat. You may have seen. Actually, I don't think it was reported on too much in the English language press, but shortly after this period, the French government sent in troops and was supporting the government. I am not 100% sure what the situation is now, but I do know it's more stable, although that part of that region is not particularly stable in general, and there are new threats now if you think about, for instance, Boko Haram in Nigeria, which is not very far away, encroaching from that direction, so. And of course the library was destroyed, and many of the artifacts and things from Timbuktu will be gone forever. There's nothing that can be done about that.
Okay. Oh, comment or question here?
I'm interested in how it fits in with the rest of what's going on in African cinema. And also, I was struck by some kind of really classical references. Like, well, one thing I wanted to say was about the football. For me, the poignancy of that was also that the guys, the jihadists, had previously been talking about football. And the kind of crazy woman reminds me of the Fool in Lear and things like that. So it just feels a very multi-layered film that is very African, but has these kind of contextual or sort of small eruptions that seem to fit within wider cinematography.
I think that's definitely true, and I think that also there are a lot of references to a wider context of African literature in film. So the Fool character, of course, has the reference to Shakespeare, but there's also a reference to, for instance, Cheikh Amadou Kane and L'Aventure Ambiguë, which is one of the most famous novels of Francophone Africa, in which a fool becomes a central character. There's the kind of motif of the court. I think the motorcycle, particularly at the end scene, that motif is something that you see elsewhere in African cinema. There are a lot of lines of correspondence, I think. I mean, Ingrid might be able to say more about this, but I think with the work of Sembène from Senegal, and particularly the focus on ordinary people, ordinary lives, outside of an urban center, that brand of Africa. So I think it's incredibly rich, and I think, you know, the vocabulary with which it's shot really shows this as well. I mean, I was really struck watching it this time by the duration of most of the shots. They're all extremely long, especially that pivotal scene when Amadou is killed. It lasts for far longer, I think, than we're accustomed to seeing in cinema. It's almost acutely uncomfortable as you watch. And these really long duration shots that are kind of mixed in with these longer duration tight shots of the faces of the actors. And I think that that just conveys so much with so little in a very subtle way. And it is completely, as you say, layered with references, not just to African cinema, but to a kind of wider body. And I think particularly it's interesting to think about this in terms of both Arabic and sub-Saharan African cinema, because that was something else that I felt was melded in quite seamlessly in this film. Any other questions? Are we going to the cafe bar?
I think we are.
Yes, excellent.
Okay, see you in the cafe bar. Thank you very much.